Thank you. Dr. Rausch.
I'd like to thank the subcommittee for allowing me the time to talk a little bit about my experiences with term limits. My name is Dr. David Rausch, and I'm the Teal Bivens Professor of Political Science at West Texas A&M University in Canyon, Texas. The ideas and opinions expressed in this statement are mine alone and not those of West Texas A&M or the Texas A&M University system. I've been studying term limits for about 30 years. In August 1989, I started graduate school in political science at the University of Oklahoma. I was fortunate to be a graduate fellow at the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. That fall, Oklahoma businessman Lloyd Noble began the process that led to Oklahoma enacting the nation's first state legislative term limits in September of 1990. I've studied term limits for so many years that a graduate colleague regularly tells others that there should be term limits on people who study term limits. My dissertation looks at the first years of the state legislative term limit phenomenon. Notice I did not say movement, because I have a different perspective on what a movement is versus a phenomenon. I combined a careful review of the news media in the states that enacted term limits from 1990 to 1995 with interviews of those term limit leaders. I also published a number of research articles looking at the effects of term limits on electoral competition in Oklahoma. While attending a training session in 1991, I learned about the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors in California. Voters in San Mateo County enacted term limits on the Board of Supervisors, which is a legislative executive body, in 1980. By 1992, the first supervisor would be termed out of office. So in an article, I report that the most significant effect of term limits in San Mateo County was that that supervisor who was about to be termed out spent a lot of time looking for other offices to run for. My research suggests that term limits have not had all of the positive effects predicted by supporters, but also that they have not had all of the negative consequences. So being a good social scientist, I come square down the middle. I'm neither happy or sad in this case. Since 2000, I've been collecting data, some media reports, and other published political science research on both Oklahoma and San Mateo County to expand my research over that 30 to 40 years worth of experience with term limits. By 2020, the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors will have conducted county business under term limits for 40 years, while the Oklahoma legislature will have experienced term limits for 30 years. Such research should provide insights into the positive and negative effects of term limits on legislative bodies. The enactment of term limits, as my colleague has already pointed out, has been a boon to research on state legislatures. Much of the new research examines any changes wrought by term limits by looking at the new relationships between legislatures and constituents, the dynamics of legislative leadership, and the effects on legislative demographics, so diversity. The most powerful research seeks to understand how term limits affect the work of legislatures with the other branches of state government. A lot of the changes that have been found in California, we talked a little bit about that. There's a research project that found that while political careerism continues, members of the legislature look for other offices, that the number of female and minority representatives actually increased in the California legislature, but that the legislature was less likely to challenge the governor on his budget. Research has examined more specific questions. In Oklahoma, for example, Oklahoma legislators seem to be serving longer after term limits were enacted than before term limits were enacted. But it's such a small difference of about 1.5 to 2 years in office. We also take a look at what's called the last term effect. What happens to a legislator, or in this case a member of Congress, in their last term? And most of the research has found that there's really no significant difference in the activities. They're either not enacting or not introducing as much legislation, or they're introducing less legislation and focusing on quality versus quantity in their last term. Probably the best source, if you're looking for information, is a really thick book that looks specifically at the state of Michigan by Sarbaugh, Thompson, and Thompson. They actually looked at term limits for 13 years, interviewed about 460 members of the state legislature and other observers, and they essentially found that the legislature has become less accessible to the executive branch, which is very interesting. And they've also found that there is a bigger gap now between the legislature and their constituents. Political science needs to better understand how legislative term limits change the status and work of state legislatures. Does the length of the limits make a difference? It's interesting how we seem to be kind of holding on 6 and 12 when maybe one term in each body might be an appropriate number. That might make it a much more accountable body. I'd like to be able to determine that one term limit that best amplifies the positive effects of term limits while maintaining the delicate balance between the three branches of government. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burgott.
Chairman Cruz,